the Reagan era basically changed the paradigm because it adhered more to lessons from classical economics and moved more in the direction of a freer market. But to call it a free market is a bit of a misnomer. Even though Reagan called it free market economics, it was more of a blending of the previous system with some free market principles. So if we look at some of his policies, like he increased defence spending, he attempted to balance the federal budget, slowed the growth of government spending, reduced federal income tax and capital gains tax, reduced government regulation, tightened the money supply to reduce inflation. And I mean, to our minds, that all sounds great, doesn't it? But it's not.
Note the distinction: slowed the growth of government spending.
I was going to point that out myself.
Did not reduce it. He slowed the growth. He did not stop the government from expanding.
So that was actually where I was going to point the finger and say, well, it's not exactly free market economics as we know it, but it's a sort of blending of the two systems. It's
like
more free market.
Neoliberalism, you could say.
Well, yes. He was the sort of father of neoconservatism, wasn't he?
I think you could go further and say William F. Buckley and James Burnham were probably more closer, but if you're talking in terms of actual strict political power in office,
that's what I had in mind. So yes, there is a bit of an exception to the rule there, but for most of the time, America had protectionist policies. So it's also worth pointing out as well that, again, that America inherited their policies from this mercantilist view originally, but they did alter it in their own way. They tried to devise their own more reasonable, more, I don't want to say rational because that's not the right word, but something that is more befitting of the real world than this mercantilist view. So starting with George Washington, I'm going to read a quote here. "I use no porter of cheese in my family, but such as is made in America." So he's saying that he doesn't import any cheese, but this...
What you're saying is the American obsession with cheese goes back a very long way.
But the funny thing is that this was a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, sent on the 29th of January, 1789. And he's, of course, a Frenchman, and he was saying, yes, we only have American cheese here, thank you very much. And saying that to a Frenchman.
Yes.
So well done, Washington. You might be a rebel, but at least you're sticking it to the French. Although he was a friend of Lafayette, and he helped them in the American
Well, I mean, I
Revolution,
suppose if you have to, you can be friends with the French. Just make sure to insult them every now and again, stop them from forgetting their place.
I think he was just saying it more in terms of economic policy. I don't think he was actually trying to be rude, but I'm going to pretend that that's what he wanted because that's what I wanted to hear. So it's also worth pointing out that one of Washington's first acts of Congress was signing a tariff in which the purpose was, and I quote here, the encouragement and protection of manufacturers. So pretty cut and dry. Washington was in favour of this, and we're going to get into the weeds a bit more as to why this might be beneficial. And someone who we both acknowledge is very important in this discussion is Alexander Hamilton.
The original proponent of the American system, and I
Indeed.
think also George Washington's Treasury advisor.
Yes, he was indeed,
when he was president, yes, which makes sense as to why Washington took on those positions.
So he was the main mind, as we alluded to, behind the group of ideas that seem to complement one another, and they can be either referred to as the American School of Economics, the national system, or the American system. And what it consists of is support for a high tariff to protect American industries and generate revenue for the federal government, maintenance of high public land prices to generate some more federal revenue, preservation of the Bank of the United States to control currency and rein in state and local banks whose transactions are deemed as risky by the federal government, and development of infrastructure such as roads and canals, and later on epitomised by the railways. Of course, Americans quite often say how the West was opened up by the railway, which would increase the efficiency of transportation, and this would be financed by these tariffs and land sales. So this is the system that he devised.
Yeah, I think prior to Abraham Lincoln as well, something ridiculous like 90% of all American government funds were raised through the tariff system. So they barely got taxed anything.
I will be touching on that, don't
purely
worry.
because of the tariffs.
So Thomas Jefferson said after the War of 1812, and I quote directly here, "Experience has taught me that manufacturers or manufactures are now as necessary to our independence as to our comfort. And if those who quote me as of a different opinion will keep pace with me in purchasing nothing foreign where an equivalent of domestic fabric can be obtained without regard to difference of price. So he's saying that in the case of the foreign war, the War of 1812 was of course against Britain, it's very important to have your own domestic industries, even though the price might be more expensive.
He's saying that you've got a national duty.
Yes, and it is very much invoking this nationalism, isn't it? He's saying that you have a duty to buy American because if you want America to continue existing as a country, you have to support American industry because it was essential for us to protect our sovereignty.
Yeah, especially as a very young nation at that point.
Exactly,
still.
Yes. So moving on to Abraham Lincoln, and I'm reading a quote here, "Give us a protective tariff and we will have the greatest nation on earth." I mean, that aged quite well, didn't it?
Yes, there is connective tissue as well between the two, because between Hamilton and Lincoln, there was Henry Clay, who was also a student of Hamilton's, who I think knew him before he died, and then he went on to work with Lincoln when he was in, I think it was the Whig Party of America, which existed in the mid-1800s for a while.
Yes.
But I think it's with Abraham Lincoln where the divisions and difficulties with enforcing protective tariffs can become apparent, because as I spoke about in my premium video, I don't know if you're going to get into this at all, so stop me if you are.
You can go ahead if you want.
Yeah, but basically there was the big division in the US between the North and the South. The North, which was entirely almost entirely manufacture based and had lots of industry that were being well suited to the protective tariffs, and then you had the South, which, as well as the slave work, economy. Well, it's not the economy, slave workforce that they had.
Okay.
I forgot the proper term for it. As well as using slaves for the work to tend the fields and such, they were almost entirely agrarian and relied on foreign trade to be able to survive by exporting cotton, primarily to England.
Well, it makes sense that they would be more in favour of free trade because they had no labour costs, pretty much, in that they didn't have to pay their workforce. They still had to pay to maintain them, obviously.
Yeah, they didn't have to pay them individually. But as a result of Lincoln increasing the tariff to make it even more protectionist, because I think it was 15% tariff, and then it was going to 50% tariff, and obviously that's going to make it very difficult. If you're not buying stuff from England anymore, they're not going to want to buy your stuff, because I mean, that's only fair in their own eyes from a political manoeuvring. The South ended up being very unhappy with the idea that they were about to be screwed out of their main source of income and being able to support themselves, which was one of the things that spurred on the War for Independence.
Absolutely. So he's also warned that the abandonment of protective policy by the American government must produce wanton ruin among our people. And the wording in modernity makes it sound like he wants this to happen, but that's not what he means. He's saying that this is an inevitable consequence if they abandon protective policy.
Well, I mean, he did also threaten the Southerners in his first inaugural speech when he said, like, listen, guys, just go ahead with the tariff and there doesn't have to be any bloodshed. Is a paraphrase of what he said.
But yes, his belief was that a tariff would introduce a temporary price increase, but this would eventually decrease again as production efficiency increased, which would mitigate the rise as time passed. That was his belief, which isn't necessarily unreasonable.
It's just unfortunate that the divisions between the North and the South escalated to what they did.
And as you alluded to earlier, he favoured this tariff over an income tax. So, and I'm quoting directly here, "The tariff is the cheaper system because the duties being collected in large parcels at a few commercial points will require comparatively few officers in their collection, whilst by the direct tax system, the land must be literally covered by assessors and collectors going forth like swarms of Egyptian locusts, devouring every blade of grass and other green things." I wish our own politicians still had the same scorn towards tax collectors and the prospect of income tax.
If only. The American historical hatred of taxes is legendary.
What happened to some of you? Not all of you.
I mean,
All of you that are watching are probably
to be fair to them,
on the good side.
yeah, to be fair to them, we still have worse taxes than they do
We
for the
do,
most
yeah.
part.
There's no criticism here. I'm
not
very
that theirs
jealous.
is amazing or anything, but they only get 37% income tax on the top bands. We get 20% in the mid-range and then 45% of the top bands. And I hate it.
So moving on to Ulysses S. Grant, and I'm quoting directly here. For centuries, England has relied on protection, has carried it to the extremes, and has obtained satisfactory results from it. There is no doubt that it is to this system that it owes its present strength. After 2 centuries, England has found it convenient to adopt free trade because it thinks that protection can no longer offer it anything. Very well then, gentlemen. My knowledge of our country leads me to believe that within 200 years, when America has gotten out of protection, all it can offer, it will too adopt free trade. Which is, again, quite a salient point in that
Well, it does.
I think it was before 200 years, really, but I suppose he couldn't predict.
It does kind of make sense because what will inevitably happen if you protect your industries and they build up to enough of a level of efficiency to the point where they can compete, if they do compete on the free market, well, in free trade, and then they win, you've basically, as I say, you've basically got political power over all of those countries that then become dependent on you for particular materials and particularly manufacturing.
Yeah, and America's definitely not done that, have they?
No, not in the slightest.
Definitely didn't loan us lots of money in the world wars and then use us as
and then recently again, and they keep doing it, almost like we're completely dependent on them.
It's funny that. So moving on to Theodore Roosevelt, and this is an extract from his State of Union address in 1902. The country has acquiesced in the wisdom of the protective tariff principle. It is exceedingly undesirable that this system should be destroyed or that there should be violent and radical changes therein. Our past experience shows that great prosperity in this country has always come under a protective tariff. And of course, this is just continuing. You've got both Democratic and Republican politicians basically parroting the same line here, that these are the way in which America becomes wealthy, and in the fact that it was a relatively young country, it has to establish its industries first. Britain was the first to industrialize and also America's main competitor, and therefore it makes sense that they are very protective when Britain is at its most inclined towards free trade. So an important point is post-World War II, the United States is unanimously the dominant country in the world, and therefore this includes American industry. In fact, it's likely because of American industry that they were so successful, because it allowed them to produce the goods that they lent to Britain and lots of other countries,
well, even
and the loans.
Companies like Standard Oil in the late 1800s, revolutionizing oil production, made it incredibly. And when you're exporting oil on that level, you're going to become powerful.
Absolutely. So, again, it's worth returning to Reagan. Also, Bush Sr. and Clinton carried on his policies, and they recognised that America was the dominant country, and therefore there was less need for these protectionist policies, and they did move towards more free trade than before. Interesting as well that Reagan, obviously Republican, Bush Sr. Republican, Clinton Democrat, and yet they still maintained the same policy.
Well, it seems to be, historically speaking, that when you look at it, it's a policy that does get results. And you can say that things could have gone differently or better if they hadn't, but as far as the actual empirical results that we do see, it works.
But going through American history, it's very clear to me that the circumstances were so undeniable as to whether it was beneficial to be protectionist or be in favour of free trade, that no matter which political party the politician comes from, they can recognise this and actually follow through with what circumstances dealt them.
Yeah, I do think as well with America, because it's such a large and diverse country in terms of the infrastructure and climate and the general culture across each state, is that even without having to engage in the outside world, they can still be incredibly highly competitive just domestically.
Well, the American landmass is about the same size as Europe if you include the European portion of Russia. If you get rid of that European portion of Russia, Europe's about half the size of America, and there's plenty of competition within Europe. The states are more or less the equivalent of the US states, aren't they? They're all competing with one another for wealth and all the other things.
We can even see how the states are still competing nowadays, with Florida hoovering up all of the disenchanted remnants of California and other blue states.
So to return back to the sort of timeline of American policy, under Bush Jr. there was a return to protectionist policies again, largely due to 9/11. There's also the introduction of a steel tariff in 2002, which he removed at the end of 2003, as it had provable adverse effects on things like national GDP and employment rates. So they basically crunched the numbers, realised that yes, this was kind of a mistake to introduce this tariff. But because America was competitive then, because it was at the top of its game, and therefore introducing protectionist tariffs, they don't really work. And in fact,
when you're already at the top of your game and you introduce those tariffs, all you're doing is asking for your industry to stagnate.
Yes. So tariffs before were between 0 and 1%, and Bush introduced one that was between 8 and 30%, depending on, obviously, which country they're on about, which is huge, massive increase in price. So no wonder it harmed the industry. So yes, it also disproportionately affected the United States internally. So steel producing swing states, like it's worth mentioning they're swing states, by the way, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia would benefit from the tariffs. However, steel using states such as Tennessee and Michigan were harmed by the tariffs. Notice how 3 states versus 2 states there as well. So, it's almost like Bush was doing it for political reasons and not for economic ones. And in fact, Bush's administration basically admitted that that was their reasoning for it after they left office.
When it no longer makes economic sense, what you're basically just trying to do is wave political gestures and favours at potential, like you say, swing states that could have working class voters who are going to vote for whoever's going to be most likely to protect their jobs.
Exactly.
As far as they perceive it.
And on a completely unrelated note, Donald Trump, in his first address to a joint session of Congress, he said, "Currently, when we ship products out of America, many other countries make us pay very high tariffs and taxes. But when foreign companies ship their products into America, we charge them nothing or almost nothing. I believe strongly in free trade, but it also has to be fair trade." So I don't necessarily agree that this is a problem, because, of course, the reason that the other countries have tariffs is that they can't compete with America. And therefore they have tariffs to protect their own industries. It's a product of being the dominant country.
Yeah, it does show some of the negatives, though, that can be encouraged by it, which is just that by having the tariffs in the first place, it disincentivizes other countries from trading with you. It can,
and of course, retaliatory tariffs are always a possibility, which coincidentally is what Donald Trump did. Obviously, the most famous one is increasing tariffs on China, and he also increased them on the EU as well to try and compete with Europe. And
I do think there is more of a practical reason for doing it against China, given that.
Well, I was about to get onto that.
All right.
So obviously, you don't want China, who are your political enemies, you don't want an interdependence with them, because the possibility that you might go to war is always there. And also, you don't want to necessarily encourage their economic development, do you, in free trading with them? And as America, one of the most prosperous countries in the world, if they lose out on trade with America, well, that's a big deal to them. It might hamper their growth. And especially when Trump was in office, there was a danger, and there still is a danger, of China falling into the middle income trap. And if you take the trade away until they fall into this trap, then you can trade with them again and be relatively content that their threat is out of the way, at least many years down the line. That's not going to come anytime soon. And Joe Biden has reduced the tariffs on the EU, but has kept the Trump-era tariffs on China, which makes sense
again.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Biden wanted to try and keep Europe on side with America, That was his thinking behind it, or at least the people who control Biden's thinking behind it.
Whoever they end up being.
So with America's history of protectionist policies out the way, you can start to see a bit of a picture of why they were so adamant that it was beneficial to the United States. Obviously, the main competitor was Britain up until around World War II, where America unanimously became the dominant country, and therefore they could afford to reduce their tariffs and get an influx of cheaper goods, more or less. And this is to the consumer's benefit. And ultimately, the consumers are the ones that benefit from free trade, first and foremost, I would say. But of course, there is the realities that step in where if you carry on with free trade, which we'll see to Britain's detriment later on as a comparison, it's not always beneficial to the average person.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.